just introducing the panel in no particular order. If you could just say hello in a very, very quick sentence about who you are. Dr. Len Fisher, Research Fellow at the University of Bristol. Len?
Well, that's absolutely summarised me. Thanks very much, and hello, everybody.
Okay. Kate Murdoch, Service Manager, Planning, Policy and Implementation at Somerset Council, but from our point of view, somebody who actually knows about how the phosphates issue is impacting upon housing and what the council is doing about it. Kate?
Yeah, hello everyone. I mean, you've explained it all there, Mick. Thank you.
Okay, Matt Wheeldon. Matt is the Director of Infrastructure Development at Wessex Water. And a man brave enough to say he's a wild swimmer as well. Matt, anything else to add?
I'm passionate about the environment, Mick, and
Right.
I've been in the water sector for 24 years. Well, let's say I've never known anything like it.
Right. Okay. Can I ask, is Penny Johns here, Professor Penny Johns? Can't see the name. Not coming in under a pseudonym or.
I'm sure she. This is Phil, but I'm sure she'll.
Yeah.
I'm sure she'll come, Mick. She's just
Right.
not quite got here yet.
Okay. And can I introduce two people who I wouldn't claim to be expert on phosphates, at least when they set out on this journey, but are experts in filmmaking. Phil Shepherd. Want to say hello?
Hi, this is me. Keep intervening. Yeah, I'm Phil.
Right. And John, Dr. John Potter. Where are you?
Just John Potter. Hello.
Yes.
Me.
Right. Okay. I think it's fair to say that the two of you, although you didn't set out as experts in phosphates, have been on a learning journey over the past few months in putting this film together.
You could certainly say that, Mick. Yeah.
Right.
We didn't know anything about it at all, so we just followed on what we found, and we thought that might interest people. That you're going to see it in the way that we saw it, almost. So yeah, right. Hopefully you will enjoy it.
Okay. Right. Just a reminder that when we do come back together, it's helpful to keep your videos off so that we don't use up bandwidth. Any sort of comments, questions from the panel before we ask people to start watching the film? And we'll see you back at 9:40.
Mick.
Okay. Yes.
May I just say, I'm sure we have many distinguished people among us that I'm not aware of, but one name I do see there is Anthony Gibson, who I'm very pleased has been able to join us because he was able to greatly inform the early stages of the film and was for many years National Farmers Union Southwest person. Right. And there he is.
Yes.
Hello,
hi, Andy. Thanks very much for joining us. Yes. Okay, so it's 8 minutes past 8.
Mick, just one thing, we're going to keep the chat open. Don't go away from Zoom. If you're able to watch on a different screen or something, that would be brilliant, or just have it minimized. But we'll keep the chat open so that people can type in questions as they go along if they want.
Yeah, that's helpful as they occur to you as we go through the film. You may have forgotten by the time you get to the end what that great point you were going to raise was. So if you could use the chat, it would also help me to see whether or not there are common themes coming through that I can put to the panel. Okay, well, let's start.
John, we've been asked to do a film about phosphates. Phosphates? Where do we start with that? phosphates.
What's it called?
Phosphate. Where do we start with that?
What's it called? Well, I want my zoom image, yeah, but it'll kill off this thing.
So this is where the story starts.
Right.
2022.
Right.
Okay, I'm just going to step in for a moment. It's Anthea, the editor-in-chief, just because we're having one or two technical difficulties. So hopefully everybody's now watched the film. Mick, if you're able to stop your YouTube video coming on, that would be great. And then we can get stuck into, I'll hand over to you again and we'll get stuck into questions. Great film, by the way, Phil and John. Thank you very much for doing that. It's obviously attracted a lot of interest. Thank you. Mick.
You're muted at the moment, Mick. So when you're ready, you need to unmute yourself.
Penny Johns to explain.
I'm just trying to
Phosphorus smell, yellow waxy stuff that burns. The thing that plants and animals use, phosphates. That's when you combine phosphorus with oxygen and other things. So it makes nice long chains. That's now a molecule.
Right, we can't. Right. Mick, if you can turn off your YouTube, that would be great.
And there are lots of different forms of phosphorus.
Sorry, Anthea, could you just take over while I try
Yes.
and kill
Yeah.
off this
Okay.
version of the film?
Waving around this great cycle.
Okay, well, this is a pretty hot topic, and I think I'm not quite sure how Mick was going to handle this, but what I would like to know is I would like a few words from everybody who is involved in the making of the film, just to talk about why it's such an important topic and why it's such a hot topic. And perhaps Penny, we could start with you, please.
Yeah, sure. So phosphorus is one of a number of nutrients which are essential for life. So we've known this for, millennia. We've been adding them in various forms to food production systems ever since people settled down and started to occupy the landscape in sedentary ways. And in the last 150 years or so, we've been using rock phosphate, which is mined from phosphorus-rich minerals, currently in areas like China and Morocco, and that's ground up and applied to the soil for the production of crops. We then consume that phosphorus, which we also need it to sustain life, along with nitrogen, and together we then excrete those into sewage systems. So when we look at a polluted river that's got phosphorus pollution problems, it's usually got nitrogen pollution problems too, and the two of them together drive increased production in that water body, and so you get overproduction of life, and that leads to these unsightly effects on the watercourse, which also leads to biodiversity loss, and there are implications for human health as well. So I can take you through those if you want to know them, but essentially it's coming from both agriculture and from sewage systems, and those might be anything from septic tanks to soakaways, which aren't soaking away anywhere they should, through to small packet sewage treatment works in your local village, or there might be big wastewater treatment works where it's possible to do some more sophisticated phosphorus removal from the water before it's discharged into the receiving watercourse. Just one thing to say before I finish is that people need to remember that when we talk about treating sewage, the treated effluent is not clean. It's just got some of the things removed, and it's packed full of other contaminants, and it will still have phosphorus in it. So it's not clean, it's just less dirty than it was before it was treated.
Can I turn to Kate, please?
Sure. So our main interest as a council at the moment is the impact it's having on housing delivery. So I work for the local planning authority, and just to correct something at the beginning of the film, it mentioned the letter that local authorities got in March 2022. We actually got our letter in August 2020 for this, and that's for the Somerset Levels and Moors catchment area. The letter in March 2022 covers the River Axe catchment, which means that most of Somerset now, with the exception of the kind of former West Somerset area, is caught by phosphate neutrality requirements. So what that means is that housing development needs to demonstrate that it's nutrient neutral, i.e. that it isn't making the situation any worse, before we can then give planning permission. And at the moment, we've got about 6,500 houses held up in the current planning applications across Somerset. But if you look at local plans in terms of what the future growth is for Somerset, it equates to about 18,000 houses that would have been delivered by about 2032 that will currently be held up in the system if we can't find a way of unlocking them through kind of nutrient neutrality requirements.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Penny. Sorry, I was muted while I was thanking you. Len, just a few brief words from you, and then we'll go to Matt. Thank you.
Well, I think there's two things. One is, I'm afraid that most people know so little about science, even about what phosphorus and phosphates were, or the fact that there's a difference. And this isn't to criticize people who don't know much about science. It's certainly to criticize us scientists for not making it more available. So you need a picture. And one of the pictures here, you can't just get, you might think you can just filter the phosphorus out, you filter the nitrogen out. You can't. They're dissolved. And you've got to find some way of handling that, which is not all that easy. And the other thing, which I think we brought out, Penny and I, in the film, but which I think deserves repeating, is that this is just one problem out of many. We're trying to let people know the facts, know what it's about, but pollution, even of this limited nature, is tied in as a problem with a whole lot of other problems, even population movement, all of those things are all tied together in one big problem. So we can set up rules, we can set up regulations, but that's a first step. It's really hard to work out how to take that step so that we have enough flexible policy, say for a council, to be able to set up housing. Now you're tied down to phosphates and nitrates, etc. But there's a whole lot of other things, as you know well, Kate, that also have to be considered. And they're not just additive, they interact. And it's that interaction that's really hard for planners such as Kate to be able to handle it all. Really difficult. Sorry to be so negative.
No, I think, well, it's a lot to handle, isn't it? I think we'll just turn to Matt. And Matt, I think it's very good of you to be here.
It's a pleasure.
I think people are very concerned that, we're getting questions on the chats. You've probably seen, there's a lot about what Wessex Water is going to be doing, what all the water companies are going to be doing about the problem. And people want to know what you have been doing for the last several decades.
Yeah. Well, the answer is a lot. I think Len was just saying out to people who don't understand a lot about science. People also don't understand a lot about how regulation works and the fact that we do what we're told to do by the environmental regulators. So when it comes to phosphates, we don't do what we want to do. We don't, we get told, I've got to hit a standard. And so according to whatever the environmental regulator states, we then plan and then we deliver. So in the Somerset Levels, for instance, we have 8 of our water recycling centres have phosphorus permits at the moment. And they've been in for a number of years. Those standards were set by the Environment Agency. And then not only do we deliver them early, but also we outperform those standards. And when you look at the load currently being discharged from those 8 water recycling centres, it is at about 30% of the allowable load that the permit sets us. And we're putting more in because we're being asked to put more in. So not only are we doing what we're told to do, but we're outperforming what we're told to do. So I think maybe there's a lack of understanding that we don't have free reign, that we are heavily regulated. So the discharge that comes out of every water recycling centre is monitored, and we've got to hit those. And as I say, we massively outperform against our phosphorus targets in the Somerset levels by about 70%. And all that data off what I've just published on their website, a long-term history of phosphorus. So it's all out there. And we're being told to invest in more sites. So that's what we're currently doing. And we'll have a number of more sites that will come on as per the requirements that we've been given by December 24, which is kind of the next sort of deadline. And then there's even more to come in the future. So these investments, because what sewage water recycling centers do is they're moving the phosphorus element from the liquid into the biosolids, so into the fertilizer, and they remove. The discharge generally goes down from about 5 milligrams per litre to about 0.5. Some of the targets were being set in the future about 0.25 milligrams per litre of phosphorus in the discharge. So you're removing about 80% of the phosphorus from what's coming in, and it's going out into the solid, into the biosolids, which is sold as a fertilizer, not out into the liquid, which goes back into the rivers. And those, as we get down to lower and lower levels, we have to put in more and more chemicals and energy to achieve that. So what we're seeing is, as we reach these really low levels, the technology required at quite what would have been quite basic sewage works is going up massively, and get some pretty huge costs for quite small reductions in phosphorus. So someone's asked, what have we done? Well, we've already, up to 2020, we've removed about 108 tons a year. This current 5-year period, we're going to be removing another 60 tons, and the plans for beyond that, I think there's another 75 tons coming out. But these are not our targets. These are targets set by the environmental regulator. And as I said, we always outperform them.
Okay, Len, you've raised your hand. You want to answer that? Yeah.
No, I don't want to counter it. I
No.
want to agree with it. I think Matt has made a very concrete example of the point that I was making. In order to get the phosphate levels down, you need to put in very much more energy. So you've got a high energy cost. These things tie together. You can go all the way up to the United Nations and their Sustainable Development Goals. And it's only, they set all these individual targets, like you're setting individual targets for phosphate and for using energy, for not using oil, but where's the energy going to come from? They're all tied together. And I would like to see things like Matt's agency working with others as a group to tackle these wholesale and look at the overall outcome, rather than these individual targets which impact on each other. And Matt just gave us a very nice example of that.
I think what we'll do is we'll turn to some of the questions that we've got coming in. And here's one from Rupert Goddard. Do you think planning authorities will be sufficiently staffed to monitor that nutrient neutrality is occurring in new developments in phosphate-enriched catchments? Kate, I think that's one for you.
That's one for me. It will be a challenge. I wouldn't disagree with that. But at the moment, what we are doing is building a monitoring charge into the Section 106 agreement. So they are the agreements that we put in place with the developer or landowner, and they remain in place to monitor that nutrient neutrality. This Section 106 agreements are used for all sorts of planning obligations that might be placed on the developer. And at the moment, we're putting on a monitoring fee so that we can then ensure that we can monitor those nutrient neutrality measures that have been put in place. And they are all signed off by Natural England.
I think as a layperson and lay people, seeing the headlines in the papers all the time about, our rivers being in an appalling state and almost nothing rated as good. I think for a lot of people, there's a lot of cynicism about the Environment Agency and Natural England, and an element of not, I mean, greenwashing isn't the word, but of developers promising to do things which they then don't do and nobody catches them not doing it. So I think that's a concern that's going to carry on. Would you agree with that? Is that?
Well, I think we need to be aware that both the Environment Agency and Natural England have had significant cuts to funding since 2010. And so, you know, it goes back to the point that Penny was making earlier. We're all responsible in one way or another for the impact that we all have on the environment. And I'm not here to defend decisions made about funding of these agencies. But if we want them to be able to monitor and enforce effectively, they need to be funded and staffed effectively to do that job, really. And that is part and parcel of some of the problems. I mean, the local authority, like I said, got the letter in August 2020 with no prior warning. Ideally, we'd have been given some prior warning that the Somerset levels of moors was moving from a favourable to an unfavourable condition, so that we could start putting these measures into place without having to put a halt on housing development, which of course is having a massive economic impact at a time when we also have a national housing crisis. We've got several people waiting on waiting lists for housing in Somerset and children living in temporary accommodation.
Thank you. Right, let's take another question then. Let me just see. Right, hello from South Wales. Friends of the Lower Wye have been regularly sampling the River Trothy, I hope I said that correctly, a tributary of the Wye. It's a predominantly agricultural catchment with only a couple of small sewage works. We've consistently noticed that phosphate levels are higher in the summer, typically more than 3 parts per million, when the target level is 0.12, so it's 0.3 parts per million when the target level is 0.12. When the river is low, obviously in the summer, than in the winter. What are the primary mechanisms causing this seasonal variation? I don't know who would like to take that.
Hi, Kate. I've given an answer in the chat, so hopefully everyone can see that. But essentially, the reason you get higher concentrations in the summer months is if you have agricultural sources that are being flushed off the land, then you need rainfall to move those primarily. So they're going to get higher concentrations in the winter months and you'll get lower concentrations in the summer months. But if your delivery is coming down a pipe, now that might be from a sewage works, but it could be from any kind of piped or concentrated source in the catchment that's discharging all the time. Let's think about, for example, maybe a poultry farm. Then you're going to get cumulative loading in the system and you haven't got enough rainfall in the summer to dilute it down. So your concentration, which is the mass per unit volume of water, so the milligrams per litre of water, is going to be higher, but your load, so that's the mass on its own, just the kilograms of phosphorus in the system, may actually be lower in the summer months. So your concentration's higher, but your load may be lower, and you have to look at both of those parameters to really understand which are the likely contributing sources. The other thing to say, I was just responding to Richard again, is that he's saying that you're getting the lowest concentrations in the highest tributaries, but the highest tributaries in that system are the least intensively farmed, and they have the least people in them. And as you move downstream, you get a cumulative effect. So you're adding and adding and adding to the load that's moving through the system. And then as you move downstream, the other thing that happens is the river sort of flattens out. You start to get more pools, fewer riffles, larger, slower flowing parts of the water, maybe a couple of ponds or lakes, contributing. And as you slow the flow, the phosphorus that's attached to sediment is going to drop out of solution and become part of what we call the bed sediment of the river. And unfortunately, if you then change the oxygen status of the river because it's flowing low, because you haven't got as much rainfall, or you've added organic matter from manure or sewage, which stimulates microbial action, and the microbes consume oxygen. If you push the oxygen far enough down, the phosphorus that was happily stuck to the sediment now comes back into solution and becomes part of the load that you're seeing and the concentration you're measuring. And it's a really dynamic process, so that can change over the order of seconds to minutes over the course of a day, and it varies seasonally as well. So you've got all sorts of different kind of time streams running through your system, and when you collect a sample of water, perhaps further down the system, you've got water that some of it is seconds old, some of it is minutes, some is hours, some is weeks, some has been delivered to the river, the phosphorus, maybe 3 or 4 years previously, or even longer, depending on the ability of the river to accumulate phosphorus. So phosphorus is quite dynamic in the way in which it behaves, and unpicking where it's come from in the landscape and why it's accumulating is quite a complex task. But there's a lot of scientific research that helps us to do that. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the questioner will say whether or not. I'm going to hand back to Mick now, who's back in the room. Mick.
Apologies for that. I feel really frustrated having missed the part of the meeting that was new to me. I've seen the film before and enjoyed it. Learned more the second time, and also actually enjoyed all those lovely misty photographs of the Somerset levels. So, I'm not sure what questions have been asked so far. So are people giving show of hands if they want to raise a question? If everybody's got a question, could they show by raising the hand there?
There's somebody there.
Yeah, Phil. Phil, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I wanted to raise, in the film, there's a bit where we say there's no shortage of ideas. For example, the idea that if you remember Len explaining to us, it's not in the film, about kidney stones and how by adding, I forget what it is, but adding something to urine, you can effectively lock up. There's a way of locking up phosphate with that through that method. And there's also this project that's been going on through Bath University, where a group of students have come up with an innovative scheme which won prizes and evidently, again, begins to address this thorny issue. I wonder if anybody could tell us any more about either of those ideas, or where the potential is really to do something about this.
I wish I could remember.
Len, did you want to pick that up?
I wish I could. I wish I could remember what it was that I said. I would, if I was sitting here on Google or next to my pile of papers, I'd race back and find it. But I can't remember what I said about the kidney stones, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, coming at it. Sorry.
Phil, I could help you with that. I don't know what you said about the kidney stones because I missed that in the film. But I can tell you that there are a number of affinities that phosphate has for other chemistries that are in the system. And one of the things you can do is you can add lime or calcium carbonate. So that's what you find in limestone. And you can precipitate phosphorus out because it forms a complex with the carbonate. So it's quite a nice sort of calcium phosphate based mineral. And if any of you live anywhere in the Jurassic limestone area, so on the Cotswoldy type environment or in the chalk hills, if you were to put your hands into a stream and grab some of the plants and you rub them between your fingers, you'll feel that they feel gritty. You feel like you've got sand grains between your fingers. And that's a natural process called the formation of marl. And marl is this calcium phosphate mineral. Its proper name is hydroxyapatite. And that's basically taking phosphorus out of the water and combining it with that calcium carbonate to form these calcium phosphate minerals. When you talk to Matt, maybe Matt can come on this in a minute, but for example, if you want to have a phosphorus stripping tower at a major wastewater treatment works, which I think you're now calling water recycling centres, Matt, then they'll have a tower full of iron-rich sand, and the iron is Fe3+, so it's lost 3 electrons, and then the phosphate is PO4 3-, so it's gained 3 electrons, and they're basically a marriage made in heaven. They stick together really firmly. So you drip your phosphate in at the top from your treated effluent, and it strips up to about 90% of the phosphorus can be stripped in that way. But one of the problems we have is that we are only doing that at the largest sewage treatment works. So these are the kind of works that are serving populations of 10,000 people or more. Now, in an environmentally sensitive area, it may be that you will have your water company will decide to invest in that kind of technology at smaller treatment works in order to really protect an environment. So you can have that invested, but there's no requirement in law for them to do that. So the smaller treatment works don't have the phosphorus stripping, the larger water recycling centres, I think I'm right in saying, Matt, do. But let Matt come back on that one.
You want to come back, Matt?
Yes, yeah, she's quite right. So just one correction is we don't choose what we do, we're told what we do. But you're right, the bigger sites have permits. At the moment, the smaller sites, or a lot of the smaller sites, don't. That is gradually changing as the Environment Agency set different permits for us. What Penny was describing is what we call tertiary aerated sand filters. So I talked about how sewage works are moving from traditional low energy, low carbon processes. And now, as we are asked to remove more, such as large amounts of phosphorus, or I say move, not remove, move it from the liquid to the solid, then we have to introduce things like tall towers full of this iron-rich sand. And what they do is they act as a kind of a filter in a way, and that helps the phosphorus settle out into the solid. So we then take the solid off-site, treat it. You saw some biomethane plants in the video. We have exactly the same thing. And once it's all digested, we then sell it to farmers. So there's the virtuous circle. And then the liquid that goes out has lower level of phosphorus in it. So those phosphorus limits are gradually being tightened by the Environment Agency. And I think, where we are, the reason we're here today is because that process was all going along in a kind of planned way until suddenly an overnight ruling was made that just stopped everything dead without anyone thinking about how do we resolve it. It's been terrible, absolutely terrible in terms of regulation, because you can't just change everything overnight. Things take a long time. So this ruling that Natural England made, no one considered the supply chain of people who build houses when they made that ruling. No one had a solution to the problem. Everyone's been scrambling around since then manically to try and have solutions to the problem. You know, when we're building a phosphorus stripping plant, it will take 3-4 years from planning, design, construction, and commissioning. So, you know, you can't change these things quickly, and yet the rules changed overnight on one day. And that's why everyone's been reeling and housing has been blocked, which is madness, really. In hindsight, wonderful gift.
Right. We've got a couple of hands going up now. Sarah, I think you were first. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi. I think
Hi there.
Hi. It's just following on from that. Something that the farmer mentioned in the video about how the phosphate load of the 12 houses that he or however many he was hoping to build on his land was like too much, but all the cows that were there. So is it really just there's no sort of recognition of net versus gross phosphate loading when there's a change of usage?
Yeah, that sounds like one for Kate, is it?
Yes. So we have on the website, when we got hit with the letter in August 2020, we really didn't know what we needed to do or how to calculate phosphates arising from dwellings. So we worked with a consultancy called Royal Haskoning to develop what's called the Somerset phosphate calculator. And in there, a developer can put in their existing land use and their proposed development, and it will then calculate what their phosphate loading is to help them identify the suitable phosphate mitigation measures. So yes, the current use of that land can be offset against the housing. Now, I don't know what advice that farmer had or what the development was he was proposing, but there is the ability to offset.
But it sounds to me as though he got it out of sync, didn't he? That he abandoned the 450 cows before proposing to build 12 houses. Whereas if he'd proposed to build the 12 houses and said he'd offset that by taking 450 cows out, that might have worked. Am I reading that right?
I don't know. I don't know the circumstances of that planning application, Mick, but you can certainly take into account the existing land use.
Yeah. Okay, Mike.
Yeah, it's another question relating to measurement. Can any of the panel give an impression of what percentage of the phosphate is actually coming from sewage and what percentage from other sources? And a follow-up to that is how accurately can you actually measure the phosphates which are coming from the less easy to measure sources?
Yes, who wants to pick? Penny.
I'll answer that one. I think the answer to that, Mike, is that no one, as far as I'm aware, has done a proper phosphorus budget or model for the Somerset levels, but it's not difficult to do. But looking at the system, I live on the edge of the system. I would say that you're probably looking at around about 70 to 80% of the phosphorus is actually coming from agriculture. And then you've got the legacy phosphorus that's built up over the years, remembering that the Somerset levels is a big saucer underground where you can't see it. It's shaped like a saucer. So once water and sediment gets into that system, it tends to slosh around. It doesn't flush out easily the way a big river like, say, the Bristol Avon might do, or the Exe, going out into the Exe estuary. And so you get these long retention times of stuff that's got in there in the first place. But I would say it's probably between 70 and 80% will be coming from agriculture. But that's based on looking at what we call the total phosphorus. So the total phosphorus includes all of the phosphorus fractions, not just the phosphate. Now, if you're looking at sewage works, maybe 70% of what's coming out of the sewage works is phosphate. So if you're only measuring phosphate, you're going to think the phosphorus from the sewage works is a really important component. But the agricultural system will be exporting what we call particulate phosphorus. So that's the phosphorus that's stuck to the sediment particles that are eroded from the land surface and then flush into the river system. That's the phosphorus that's stuck to the sediment that's dredged out of the ditches, dumped on the riverbanks and promptly slides back into the river and causes havoc there. And then you've also got the organic phosphorus that's coming out of the back end of a sheep, pig, cow, particularly cattle in the Somerset levels. So with things like the increase in the cultivation of maize on the Somerset levels, that's a massive problem because you get huge amounts of sediment erosion from those crops with the phosphorus attached to it arriving in the ditches. And then the farming of animals on the Somerset levels is very intensive. It's much more intensive now than it used to be. And as a result, you've got a big organic phosphorus loading. And they're also contributing phosphate as well from the fertilizer use. So when you add all of those things together, it's quite a significant chunk of the phosphorus that's moving through the system. In terms of how difficult it is to measure, no, it's not difficult. You've just got to invest the money to do it. We do it routinely. Many of the laboratories do. I think the Wessex water laboratories measure all the phosphorus fractions, certainly total phosphorus and phosphate routinely. The Environment Agency will, if you're in an SAC, a special area for conservation. So it's not that we can't measure it, it's just that it's not being measured frequently enough to capture these fluxes from the land, which occur when it rains and we get a big rainfall event, or we get one of those flooding events. That's the worst thing. You know, the Somerset levels does what it does best, it floods. We have acres of water sitting there, and that water, as it drains back into the ditches, is bringing huge amounts of phosphorus back into the watercourses and then flushing downstream.
So, right, thanks.
Can you ask
a
question?
Can I just pick up a comment from Tony in the chat, because it seems to be relevant to this thread. He's saying mitigation offset approximately 1.25 acre per person taken out of dairy and into orchard. Can you just explain that, Tony? You're there. You're muted, Tony.
Yeah. I'll check my microphone is on now. Well, I explain how it's where the mitigation calculations work, is that you can put waste out from domestic if you have land and take cows off. It's the balancing thing. But low-cost households, for low-cost housing, is that people don't have the resources to buy an acre of ground. Or if you buy an acre of ground, it's like £20,000. But for a reed bed is about £800.
Right.
But English Nature are not doing the assessments on reed beds, on our application, because the district council has to pay a fee to English Nature for them to assess an application, and it's a load of money. And Somerset Ecology Services do not have the capacity to assess reed beds as tertiary treatment.
Right. Thanks for that, Tony. I think is it Al Gibson? Anthony, sorry. Yes.
I'm chairman of the Somerset Catchment Partnership. We've commissioned Lancaster University to do a big study on substance flow analysis to work out where the phosphorus and phosphates are coming from and where they're going. and without going into too much detail at the moment, it's broadly 50-50, the work they've done so far from sewage treatment works and from agriculture. The point I'd like to make is that the phosphate problem in the Somerset levels does not originate there. A bullock in a grass-fed system on the Somerset levels takes out more phosphate than it puts in. And the other point I wanted to make was about anaerobic digestion or biogas or whatever you want to call it, which is great on the surface. The only trouble is that to make them work efficiently, these biogas plants need large amounts of green crop. And the green crop is usually maize. And maize is just about the most environmentally unfriendly crop that you can grow, and is a major contributor to the flooding problems that we've had on the Somerset levels when it's grown on steeply sloping land, harvested in the late autumn with compaction and heavy machinery, and the water just comes off like a sloping roof and makes the pollution in the rivers that much worse. But we are doing, as I say, we've done phase 1 of the project about phosphates in the Somerset levels. We're now embarking on phase 2. Whether we will find a way forward that is actually workable is a quite different question. But a lot of work is being done on this, and it's not as simple as Len Fisher quite rightly said. There are no easy solutions to this at all.
Right. Okay, Anthea, I think you had your hand up. Do you want to ask
again?
Yeah,
a rather might seem a rather simplistic question, but I was rather alarmed at Matt's comment that the rules changed overnight. And what I want to know is who is making these rules, and how much trust should we have in them?
So the rules were changed after something called the Dutch nitrogen case. Something happened in the Netherlands, and then Natural England then enforced those. I don't know exactly under what powers, and basically overrode the kind of process that where investment to reduce phosphorus from sewage works had been done through meeting Water Framework Directive, which is a piece of environmental legislation that's been around for some time now, which has targets for phosphorus. So kind of that due process of measurement, coming up with solutions, investing, building solutions, was then just kind of overridden by this nutrient neutrality requirement that basically said it's in a bad state, therefore we can't let it get any worse. There was no consideration to kind of a bridging arrangement whereby if it takes us 4 years to build a phosphorus plant, houses can be allowed to be built because a solution is coming to those new properties. It was, you've got to stop until and prove that those new properties don't have any net increase in nutrients into
I can see the problem with the discontinuity there. I mean, that's obvious, but does it suggest that the trajectory that we were on to reduce nutrient pollution was actually too low and was not going to produce the required results?
Probably, Mick, in hindsight, yes, but that's something to put to the people that decide on how to hit the targets, i.e. the environmental regulators. So I don't know why the Environment Agency and Natural England were looking at things differently, or appear to be looking at things differently.
Can I add something in there? I think the thing to remember is that Natural England is this statutory body appointed by government to deliver on the Habitats Directive, and the Habitats Directive has much more stringent targets for phosphorus than the Water Framework Directive. In both cases, both the Habitats Directive and the Water Framework Directive targets are nowhere near low enough to reflect an unpolluted water body state. So we might think those targets are stringent, but actually it's much worse than that. So the work that we've done has demonstrated that we need to be looking at 0.01 to 0.02 milligrams per litre of phosphorus to be anything close to unpolluted. So when I was at a meeting today that was called Better Water Quality for Wales, hearing all about the why there. And somebody from one of the research organisations said, well, the rivers are really clean now. They've never been cleaner. And they've still got 200 micrograms per litre, 0.2 milligrams per litre of phosphorus in them. That is, that is 10 times higher than the actual natural concentration. They may have got better, and that's just for one determinant, but they're nowhere near clean. So it may, I think, with regard to Natural England, and I should speak carefully because I sit on their Science Advisory Council. I'm trying to cast my mind back to whether I was involved in these discussions, but I think Natural England have just simply decided to actually apply the regulations for which they are already responsible, and that this is the approach they've decided to take. So they've had this duty since 1992. It's just that they haven't delivered on it. So I think
Yes.
that's where we are. And in terms of whether the targets are stringent enough, well, the problem we have is we've never had a national conversation about how clean we want the environment to be. We've had pie in the sky ambition in things like the Water Framework Directive saying, we'll make all the water bodies clean again. Don't worry, it'll only take 5 years. And the scientists are just jaws on the floor, shocked. We're going, there's no way you can turn the system around that fast. You can't make people change that fast. And even if we could turn the tap off tomorrow, we've got all these legacy contaminants in the system that are going to take forever, a long time, decades, to actually flush out. And anyway, the standards are way too high. There are some of the phosphorus standards we originally had. We'd have had to add phosphorus to our already polluted water bodies to get them up to the best standard for UK waters. And we said this at the time and we were ignored. So, there's a lot of scientists out there now saying, if you want to deal with freshwater biodiversity loss, and let's not forget, that's 84% of freshwater biota are now no longer in UK waters in the last 40 years. In my lifetime, we've lost 84%. We're down to the last 16%. So, you might say, well, this is uncomfortable. And I agree that the pace at which it's happened and the lack of consultation is a significant problem. Somerset County Council is not the only one that's been struggling with understanding what measures it could use. I've had conversations with Kate. I've had people phoning from West Wales going, we don't know what to do about this neutrality thing either. So, you're but by far from being the only ones who are in this situation. So the pace of change is really problematic. The direction of change is not problematic.
Well, thanks for that. I don't know whether it was mentioned while I was off with technical difficulties, but have we talked about the extent to which we know that putting in reed beds or planting forests or whatever mitigation measures are being considered? Do we know how effective they might be? Is there any evidence on that?
Mick, I can give you a little bit of context on this because we are just completing a very large programme with Wessex Water and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust on a huge wetland that's been constructed up near Slimbridge. It's been built to treat the effluent that's coming out of a relatively small site. So it's well outside your area, but a similar sort of system. And the upshot of the work that they've done, they've built 8 cells. The water flows in, splits, and then pours into one cell, which is planted with plants, and it's been designed for wildlife. Then the effluent from that one pours into the next one and eventually goes out to the watercourse. And the answer is it's doing very, very little in terms of removing phosphorus when you're looking at what we call the total phosphorus, the entirety of it. Because the thing is, if you only measure the phosphate, you can say, oh, look, the phosphates declined, therefore the wetland is working. And all it's done is it's sucked it up and turned it into another form of phosphorus. And that will then travel through the system unmeasured if you're only looking at phosphate. And then it goes back into the watercourse and it contributes to those eutrophication problems. It's doing rather a good job for nitrogen, which is interesting because it wasn't designed for that, but it's not doing a good job for phosphorus. So I think,
and microplastics.
Yeah, trapping things like that. The problem is it's, so if you really want something that's really going to remove your phosphorus from the system for a big river, like ones we're talking about, if you look over the hill, over the Mendits, and you go down to Chew Valley Lake, Chew Valley Lake is doing a brilliant job in removing phosphorus. But you think about the size of Chew Valley Lake relative to the catchment. Right. That's the sort of size of feature you need in order to actually trap the material. And at some point, Chew Valley Lake will actually fill up and there'll be no more water storage capacity in it because it will be full of phosphorus-rich sediment. But these small wetlands, I'm not entirely sure that they're actually doing a great job for phosphorus removal. They're a polishing system. They're not a treatment system.
Right. Are you agreeing with that, Matt?
Yes, I am.
Right. And so it would go on.
So I was going to say, everyone's, I guess, running around trying to tack things on, but actually the kind of land take up required to, as Penny said, do this tertiary polishing. The kilograms of phosphorus you're removing as a result is tiny in that respect. I mean, it looks great. Biodiversity is fantastic. There are multi-layered benefits of a constructed wetland. They are lovely. They're great for everything else. But in terms of if you're given a phosphate target, they're not particularly effective. You need a lot more land.
I mean, so again, from a lay point of view, from expressing as a layman, are we actually really faced with the choice of either not building any houses in Somerset or continuing to make things worse, albeit at a slower rate?
Well, that's a very good question, Mick. And if you asked AI how to remove the problem, you know what its answer would be. It would be eliminate human beings. We are big polluters, and development has never paid its way. That is fact. Every upgrade to every water recycling centre we've ever made, we've never received a penny from any developer. And that's because they don't pay for it. The customers do, the customer base does, but development doesn't. So development is subsidised. And it all comes back to the housing crisis and that overarching need or desire to build more houses. And everything from problem with increasing impermeable area and therefore storm overflow operation to phosphates. It's about people and the infrastructure that people dwell in. And so yes, as soon as you start saying this is the true cost of development, then it's a very sticky conversation to have, because actually the true cost of development is a lot higher than the current cost of development.
Right. Thank you for that. I'll come to you in a minute, Phil, but I just wanted to see whether Kate had an angle on that as well.
Well, I'm not here to defend the development industry, and we probably have historically, as a country again, not extracted the same level of value that we could do. But there's two people here, isn't there? There's the landowner that's selling the land, and if you've got a piece of land that happens to be in the right location, you see a significant uplift in land value from agricultural land to development land. And maybe we haven't also been extracting enough value from the landowners that get significant payments. But equally, there are lots of other uses for land, and we have competing demands. So there needs to be a fair value paid to the landowner if we need to address the housing crisis. Now, developers do make contributions towards all sorts of other things. So education contributions, they make contributions for health, community facilities, transport and public transport improvements and the like. But yeah, maybe we haven't been extracting enough from either the landowner who's selling the land for the development or the developers that are building those houses. But this is a kind of a bigger debate, I suppose, that we need to have around how we fund infrastructure improvements generally. And some of that are historic deficits in our infrastructure. It's not just directly related to housing development.
Right. Len, do you want to come in on this? Can you unmute yourself?
Oh, so sorry about that. I think Penny raised a particularly important point there, is the role of advisory committees. I mean, lots of us have been on these things, and you have scientists complaining that the people who are making the decisions aren't listening. You also have the people who are making the decisions complaining that the scientists aren't listening to what their problems are. Somehow, if we're going to break this cycle, we need to do much, much better than having sort of scientists advising and politicians not listening, or vice versa. I don't know whether anyone, Penny, maybe Matt, have any ideas on how this can be integrated. It seems to me it's probably the most important problem, is integrating the political, which is, it's all like in the up at Slimbridge, that's all about image. There was some scientific advice, but it's basically all about image, really, from the political side of things. You can get money for that. But on the other hand, we need to be able to advise in a practical way. I really don't know how to set it up. It's failed so often. I'd appreciate any comments.
I think if I can come in there, so that people know, I chaired the expert group that advised the government on setting the new targets for phosphorus under the Environment Act. They were announced back in December, and they're really quite challenging. They're much more challenging than anything we've had to hit before. So government is promising now, in law, to reduce the phosphorus loading and nitrogen loading from agriculture along with sediment by 40%. Now, if we had a 40% reduction,
by when?
So the original date was 2038. It's now gone to 2042, and in addition to that, to reduce the loading from point sources, from sewerage sources, by 80%. So collectively, that's a very significant reduction. Now, you know that we've been here before in terms of having ambition and then not delivering on it. So I think the issue is not about whether the ambition is there. And we had to fight hard to keep those at that level. We wanted 50% reduction. We wanted nitrogen and phosphorus reductions from wastewater. We weren't able to win that argument. We sort of held firm, and they took that advice and they've taken that into law. But you know, if you look at the Water Framework Directive, it's packed full of ambition. It just hasn't delivered on it. And the issue we tend to find is not at the level of engagement with DEFRA and the staff who are leading on this in those organisations, or Environment Agency or Natural England. They are perfectly well aware of the problem. They are perfectly well aware of the scale of it. Wessex Water, I also advise them as well. I sit on their catchment panel, and advice is free to anyone who wants it. And it's always the same, you know, it's not tailored to fit an agenda, but it's taking it beyond that. It's getting beyond the Treasury so that you actually get the investment needed. And the systematic problem that we face in the UK generally, including in Somerset, is that there is insufficient investment by government in environment. That's just the way it is. So the Environment Agency has been cut and cut and cut until they're largely ineffective in terms of monitoring and delivery. Natural England has got a shoestring budget. I can remember in my early career, I used to be able to get big research programs funded by those organisations. They don't have any money left for that at all. The water industry is funding research. That's great. But the regulators are not. So they're not getting that engagement with scientists at the coalface, saying, this is my problem, this is the solution I'm looking for. Can you do the science to show me which way to go? All of that's just ground to a halt. And that happened about 20 years ago. So government needs to actually step up and allow, and Treasury needs to allow government to invest in its statutory organisations in delivery for the environment. That's where the logjam sits.
Right. Yes. So quite often all roads lead back to the Treasury, don't they? Phil, you've had your hand up for some time. I was going to come to you and to John to ask you as to reflect on what you've learned, you know, through the journey that you've made from being commissioned to make this film to actually where we are now. And perhaps before I bring you in, Phil, Matt's got his hand up, and it looks as though you want to comment on that previous discussion. Is that right?
Yes, please.
That previous thread. So do that, and then I'll come to you, Phil, and to you, John.
So I'm just echoing what Penny was saying. The new targets are driving huge amounts of investment, and so what we're going to see over the next 5 years is a nutrient reduction program from Wessex Water, which will cost £1 billion.
Right.
Right now, that £1 billion. A lot of it's going to be met by the customers on their bills.
Yes.
In a cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
You know, so.
And in terms of percentage, can you just give a feel for how big?
Okay. So, yes. Okay. So let me give you. So this 5-year period, Wessex Water is spending in totality on everything, water supply and wastewater, £1.4 billion. In the next 5 years, we'll be spending £1 billion on this one thing. Right. We haven't even tackled storm overflows or talked about storm overflows. We're talking just nutrients, purely nutrients, N and P, £1 billion. So we are going to see a big increase in sewage bills to pay for this. And you know, it's difficult. It's difficult to hear, but this is the cost of us living and trying to protect the environment. Now, yes, the level of phosphorus will go down, but you think about our carbon emissions as a result of this. So whilst we are protecting the water, we are destroying the air. And that this is the conflict that we have as human beings. If we think in a silo, we've got to think in catchments and a holistic and system thinking. But the problem we have is regulation is generally set up in silos. And we measure this and we hit that. Let me give you, if I might give you a really great example. We've been set these targets for storm overflow discharge numbers. Okay. And so to hit that, we can hit that by building big storage tanks and treating lots of rainwater. Huge carbon footprint. Okay. So we'll achieve one target, but we'll destroy another one. Whereas actually, if we did system thinking, we would bring this back to better rainwater management and see rain as a resource, first and foremost, to capture locally and reuse and then discharge locally. But no, the targets we've been set is based on hitting one thing. So actually, we've got to think far more holistically at how we invest. And just hitting individual targets is not going to help the planet in its entirety.
Yes, I think a number of us have come across that issue in different contexts. That targets driving the wrong behaviour, driving compliance with hitting the target and missing the point. I think is
that's exactly it.
I think, Matt, you've said exactly what I said, but much better. We need system thinking, not silo thinking. Very simple.
Right. Okay. Can we just sort of begin to wrap this up? And I'm just interested in Phil and John and their reflections on the learning journey they've been on, both in making the film and also listening to a very interesting panel discussion tonight. Phil, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I did have a question, Mick, which was just, I haven't heard the word off-what used at all tonight. I've heard regulator mentioned quite a few times. I mean, where does off-what fit with this? And are they fit for purpose, in fact?
Right. Who is it? Is that one for you, Matt?
Oh gosh. So up until now, Ofwat have been obsessed with bills, keeping bills down. That is why your water and sewage bill is so low. When you compare it with your gas and electricity bill, or your council tax, or your telecoms bill, water is quite a small chunk. The average bill for 3 services, water, foul sewage and rainwater discharge, is about £450 a year. That actually, when you compare it with other utilities, is quite small. And a lot of our cost is in moving this heavy stuff called water, be it clean water or dirty water. So we carry a huge carbon footprint. And what we need to do as a society is move water around less, by using less, by capturing more, and by discharging less. In other words, we need to move away from a network system to a more disaggregated system, as people do in many other countries where water is more stressed. But we're not very good at that because we're used to drizzle, and we're suddenly realizing our climate is changing to drought and rainstorms. So I think the direction of travel should be more using what God has given us, that is the rain landing on our roof, to mean we demand less and we supply less and we're more independent.
Yes. So we can all have our water buckets out. John, do you want to say anything in conclusion? You're muted. Sorry, you're muted. You're still muted.
Am I on mute? Am I there now?
Yes, you're there now.
Sorry, I'm so analog.
I can't criticise anybody for technical incompetence, John. Tonight, of all nights, I can't.
I think when we made this film, we didn't really know what was going on really, and it was a voyage of discovery for us. And I think we presented it to lots of people, and people have gone, "Oh, I didn't know that." Most people go, "Oh, phosphate, oh, isn't that all just farm slurry going into rivers?" Well, no, it isn't. And also, I think the number of people who've seen this will realise that actually water is incredibly cheap, and it's stupidly cheap. So when their bills go up, those people will go, "Well, I can quite understand why it is going up, perhaps." So we've done a small thing for a tiny number of people. That's all.
Right. Okay. Last word, Phil. Do you want to?
Well, I guess doing this film, I mean, it was your idea, Mick, and I thank you for it, because it's been a really interesting thing. But in the end, it just reminds me that some things are too precious to sell. You know, water, energy, transport, they're public assets. They shouldn't be treated as disposable commodities. Yeah. And I'm glad we finished the film the way we did, with Penny reminding us that we're the polluters, and if we want the kind of lifestyle spouse, these are the costs.
Yeah. And I think one way or another, all the contributors have come round to that general theme, haven't they? This is difficult. There are difficult choices. We spent a long time, not just government but individuals, in ducking the difficult choices that have to be made. I mean, I can't say I fully understand the whole issue, but I'm confused at a much higher level before this exercise began. Yeah. Can I thank you again? Just before we go, I think Anthea wants to say something about Bylines Festival. Is that right?
Yes, just to say that the phosphate film will be shown at the Byline Festival between the 14th and the 16th of July. In fact, on the evening of the 15th. We're looking into live streaming the Q&A session that occurs there too with the filmmakers. So if you want to be involved, please look out for news on that in West Country Voices. And I'd just like to say personally a very, very big thank you to our guest speakers tonight, panelists who've been absolutely fantastic, very, very high quality session. I'm sure you'll all agree. And thank you very much for attending.
Yeah. Can I echo that and say thank you? Thank you also to our audience for sticking with us. And I know one or two had technical difficulties getting in, as I did, but I hope you, having persevered, think it was worth it. I certainly do.